A ghost ship drifts in the void, its only voice a final warning. The deep space freighter Odyssey's call hangs in perfect silence, its running lights extinguished and all communications dead. Then, a single automated beacon crackles to life, broadcasting a message that chills the soul. The stars have gone silent, and the void is hungry. This is the starting point of the mystery, the first tremor of the cataclysm that would become known as the virus that ended all travel. By the end of this story, you will understand the terrifying truth behind that message, and the impossible choice that saved a galaxy by sacrificing its future. What began with a single ship's disappearance would unravel the very fabric of interstellar civilization, leaving behind one haunting question: how far would you go to save a universe that could never thank you? Captain Eva Rostova felt the chill of the void long before the alert sounded. When the Odyssey's call's automated beacon pierced the silence of their own ship, the Star Runner, it was not a plea for help. It was a ghost song, a data stream from a grave. Her science officer, Dr. Aris Thorne, stared at the spectral readings, his face ashen. That ship was declared lost with all hands 3 standard cycles ago, he said, his voice low and steady. This is not a rescue, it is an exhumation. His words hung in the recycled air, a verdict that transformed their mission from one of hope to one of dread. There was no logical reason for the Odyssey's call to be here, drifting in the absolute blackness between galactic spirals. Its signal was a statistical impossibility, a single note played in an empty concert hall. Yet the coordinates were undeniable. With a heavy heart, Eva ordered the navigation computer to plot an intercept course. The Star Runner turned, its engines humming with a purpose that felt suddenly morbid, carrying them toward a mystery that should not exist. The Odyssey's call grew in the viewport, a tomb of sculpted metal hanging against the starless dark. Its hull was a canvas of scars, but these were not the clean punctures of micrometeoroids. Long, jagged furrows ran along the armor plating, as if something with unimaginable claws had tried to tear its way in from the outside. Every single airlock yawned open, their heavy doors frozen mid-cycle, offering a silent, chilling invitation to the void. Inside the Star Runner's cockpit, the silence was broken by Ensign Kaito. His voice was a tense whisper as he read the sensor data. "No life signs, Captain." "Not a single one, but the power core, it is still online." He paused, the absurdity of the reading settling over them all. "It is like the heart is still beating in a corpse." The analogy hung in the air, cold and precise. A functioning heart in a dead body meant something else was moving inside. Eva ordered a full tactical scan, her eyes fixed on the derelict. They were looking at a ship that had died screaming, its doors torn open in a frantic, final attempt to escape. Yet its central power source hummed on, a persistent, illogical rhythm in the graveyard quiet. Preparing the boarding party felt less like a rescue operation and more like an act of trespass. Each of them checked their environment suits with a new, grim focus, the hiss of sealing helmets sounding like a final breath. They were not stepping into a ship. They were crossing a threshold into a mystery that had already consumed its entire crew. The airlock door sealed behind them with a final, chilling hiss. Inside the Odyssey's call, the silence was a physical weight. Their suit lights cut beams through the absolute darkness, illuminating a corridor that defied all reason. The walls, once smooth metal, were now a forest of crystalline growths, pulsing with a faint, internal light. Captain Rostova's breath fogged her visor as her light fell upon a shape embedded within the wall. It was a human form, or what was left of one. The body of a crewman was fused seamlessly into the crystalline structure, its outline preserved in a shimmering, metallic veneer. The face was locked in a silent scream, its features rendered in an alien, glittering material. More shapes lined the corridor, each one a ghostly sculpture of a former life. their limbs contorted as if the very ship had swallowed them whole. Dr. Thorne approached the nearest form, his gloved hand hovering just inches from the glistening surface. The rest of the team stood frozen, their lights darting across the macabre gallery. This was no massacre. It was a transmutation. Thorne's portable scanner chirped, a sharp, insistent sound in the tomb-like quiet. He stared at the readout, his face pale behind his faceplate. His voice was a whisper, barely audible over the suit's comms. "It is not a disease, it is a rewrite." He looked up, his eyes wide with a horror that was more intellectual than visceral. "Their very molecular structure has been edited. The atoms that made them human have been reprogrammed, reassembled into this." He gestured at the crystalline wall. "This is not decay. It is an architectural redesign. The contagion does not kill its host. It repurposes it, integrating biological matter into a new, crystalline matrix. The ship is not just infected. It is being built into something else." The horror of his words settled over the boarding party. They were not standing in a morgue. They were standing inside a factory, and the raw material had once been human. Every surface, every shimmering form, was a testament to a process that unraveled life itself, stitching its components back together into a cold, silent, and terrifying new order. What kind of intelligence could see a living, breathing person and see only building blocks? The silence of the corridor was broken by a faint, rhythmic beeping from Eva's wrist-mounted data pad. A localized data cache, isolated from the ship's corrupted network, was still active. She motioned the team toward the bridge, their boots crunching on a fine, crystalline dust that coated the deck. The command center was a frozen tableau of the same horrifying transformation. The captain's chair was a throne of jagged, glowing crystal, and the main view screen was a solid wall of the same material, its surface swirling with faint, chaotic patterns of light. Eva found the captain's personal log terminal, its casing partially consumed by the growth but its core intact. With a tap, she initiated the final playback sequence. Static crackled, then resolved into a voice strained to its breaking point. It was Captain Ilya Vance of the Odyssey's call. His words were slow, distorted, as if spoken through a mouth slowly turning to stone. "We thought it was a discovery, a relic from a dead civilization on the fringe. It was beautiful, a perfect geometric form that hummed with a low energy. It sang to us, a song without sound, a pattern that felt like it was etching itself directly into our minds." His voice hitched, a wet, ragged sound. It did not just infect the ship's systems. It learned them. It used our own communication arrays to broadcast its own structure, a blueprint for this transformation. Now it is rewriting us. The ship is no longer a vessel. It is a cage, and our bodies are becoming its language. Every atom is a letter in a sentence we cannot read. His final words were a desperate, guttural whisper, a warning carved from his last moments of coherent thought. "Do not come looking. The signal is a lie. It is not a call for help. It is a seed, and it is hungry." The log ended, leaving only the hum of their own suits and the terrifying implication of his words. The artifact was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was an idea, a self-propagating architectural design that treated complex matter, whether metal or flesh, as raw data to be recompiled into its own image. It used the galaxy's own infrastructure, the comms networks, the power grids, the very ships that connected the stars, as its delivery system, a song that, once heard, could not be unheard. A single melody that could turn an entire civilization into its chorus. The ghost ship around them was not a victim. It was a loudspeaker, and they were now inside it. Had they just walked into the very trap the late captain had died to warn them about? The airlock's heavy thud against the Vigilance's hull should have been a sound of safety, a return to the familiar. But the silence that followed was thicker, more profound than the void they had just left. Ensign Kaito was the first to break it. his gloved hands fumbling with the seal on his helmet. "Must be a new brand of space dust," he joked, his voice a little too loud in the quiet bay. He pulled the helmet off, shaking his head to clear his dark hair. Under the sterile white lights of the decontamination chamber, a faint metallic sheen glistened across his forehead. He wiped at it with his sleeve, but the shimmer remained, clinging to his skin like powdered diamond. On the bridge, the unease deepened with every system report. Dr. Thorne stood beside the primary science station, his brow furrowed. "Captain, we are seeing minor data corruption across multiple non-essential systems," he said, his voice carefully controlled. Environmental controls report a 0.001% variance in atmospheric nitrogen. The long-range comms array has recalibrated itself twice in the last 5 minutes for no discernible reason. It is as if the ship has developed a nervous tic. These were not critical failures, not yet. They were whispers, the kind of glitches an engineer would dismiss as a cosmic ray hit or a memory leak. But coming on the heels of the Odyssey's call, they felt like the first, creeping tendrils of something far more sinister. Kaito joined them, having changed into a fresh uniform. The strange glimmer was still there on his temples and the backs of his hands. He caught Eva looking and offered a weak smile. "Just can't get clean, I guess." But his eyes betrayed his bravado, flickering with a confusion he would not voice. Eris approached him slowly, a medical tricorder in his hand. "May I, Ensign?" The device hummed as he passed it over Kaito's arm. The readings were paradoxical. His cellular activity was normal, his vitals perfect. Yet the scanner also detected a faint, resonant energy signature emanating from his epidermal layers, a harmonic frequency that matched the background hum of the crystalline growths they had just left behind. It was not on him, it was in him, a microscopic seed taking root. The crew was no longer just observing the contagion. They had brought a piece of it home with them, and it was already reading the Vigilance's own schematics, learning the language of its new host. The ghost ship's warning echoed in the silence. It is a seed, and it is hungry. The question was no longer if they were infected, but how long they had before their own ship began to sing. The cascade began not with a bang, but with a whisper. A soft, staticky hiss bled from the Vigilance's internal comms, a sound like dead air slowly learning to form words. On the bridge, Captain Rostova's head snapped up from her command console, her eyes locking with Dr. Thorne's. They both knew that sound. It was the same spectral noise that had haunted the Odyssey's call's final log. Red alert icons flickered across every screen, not blinking in unison, but in a chaotic, pulsing rhythm that felt almost organic. Ensign Kaito stumbled back from the engineering station, his hands shaking. "I have lost primary control of life support," he reported, his voice tight. "The system is rerouting power on its own. It is learning our architecture faster than we can defend it." A low hum vibrated through the deck plates, a resonant frequency that made their teeth ache. Then, the main viewscreen dissolved into a swirling, crystalline mosaic, the starfield outside replaced by a hypnotic, geometric dance of light. "The automated quarantine protocol has been terminated," the ship's computer announced in a flat, synthetic tone that was utterly devoid of alarm. The words were a death sentence. They had locked the doors to keep the infection out, only to realize the lock itself was now part of the disease. Rostova's voice cut through the rising panic, sharp and absolute. "Seal the bridge," she commanded, her gaze sweeping over her crew. "All of you. We are not containing it anymore. We are now the contaminated." The heavy blast doors slid shut with a final, resonant clang, isolating them from the rest of the ship. They were no longer the crew of the Vigilance. They were the last unassimilated components trapped inside a vessel that was actively rebuilding itself around them. The whispering static on the comms grew louder, resolving into a chorus of faint, overlapping voices that were not quite human. reciting strings of numbers and coordinates in a language the ship was teaching itself to speak. The whispering static was not just noise. It was a language, and Dr. Eris Thorne was the only one beginning to understand its grammar. He hunched over the bridge's secondary science terminal, his fingers flying across the screen, isolating data streams that the ship's own corrupted systems were trying to erase. The rest of the crew watched the main view screen, where the hypnotic crystal patterns pulsed in time with the low hum vibrating through the deck. Kaito stood apart, his arms wrapped around himself, the faint shimmer on his skin now visibly brighter. Thorne finally looked up, his face a mask of academic horror. "It is not a biological agent," he said, his voice cutting through the static. "It is not even a nano-machine. We have been looking for a particle, a physical thing we could filter or burn away. We were wrong." He turned his screen toward the crew. Displayed there was a cascading fractal pattern, beautiful and infinitely complex. "This is the pathogen. It is pure information, a self-executing memetic code." Captain Rostova stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the shimmering data. "Explain." Thorne took a sharp breath. "It uses our own technology as its transmission vector. Our faster-than-light communications arrays do not just send messages. They transmit complex data packages that tell other systems how to reassemble matter, how to plot a course, how to exist. This code hijacks that fundamental process. It is a stowaway in the very data streams that connect the galaxy. It does not infect people directly, at least not at first." His gaze drifted to Kaito, a look of profound pity in his eyes. "It infects the idea of travel itself. Every navigational chart, every set of coordinates, every FTL jump calculation becomes a potential carrier. We do not spread it by coughing. We spread it by talking to each other across the stars. We carry it with us every time we plot a course to a new world." The true scale of the horror dawned on them then, colder and more vast than the void outside. This was why the stars had gone silent. It was not a quarantine, it was a logical endpoint. Every ship that had received a transmission, every world that had welcomed a vessel, every single node in the galactic network was a potential host. The lockdown was not an imposed isolation. It was the only possible response to a plague that turned the concept of connection into its own annihilation. To travel was to spread the virus. To stay still was to be slowly rewritten by it. The galaxy had not chosen silence. Silence had been forced upon it by a song that could not be unheard. The silence on the bridge was broken by a single, insistent chime from the communications panel. Ensign Kaito flinched at the sound, his hands trembling as he worked the controls. "I am attempting to hail Central Command again," he said, his voice thin with a hope none of them felt. The channel opened not to a friendly voice, but to a blast of harsh, synthesized noise, followed by a message that echoed through the cockpit like a funeral dirge. It repeated on a loop, its tone flat and absolute. "By order of the Galactic Concord, all superluminal travel is prohibited. The Nexus is silent. The Great Filter is upon us." The words hung in the air, their meaning colder than the void outside. The Nexus was the galaxy's central communications hub, the beating heart of a civilization spanning thousands of star systems. For it to be silent meant the neural pathways of interstellar society had been severed. The Great Filter was a theoretical concept, a hypothetical barrier that prevented life from spreading across the cosmos. They had just discovered it was not a theory, it was a verdict. Captain Rostova felt the last vestiges of hope drain from her. This was not a localized outbreak. The Odyssey's call was not an isolated tragedy. The Memetic code, the song that rewrote reality, had used the galaxy's own hyperpulse networks to jump from ship to world, from outpost to hub, infecting the idea of connection at its source. Every attempt to warn others, every cry for help, had only been another vector for the plague. They were not just quarantined. They were archaeologists at the end of their own civilization, listening to its final, automated epitaph. The message was a confirmation of their deepest fear. They were not fighting to save the galaxy. They were simply documenting its death rattle. The silence that followed the broadcast was different now. It was not the silence of mystery, but the silence of a tomb that stretched for light years in every direction. What do you do when you realize you are the last ones to hear the news that everyone is already gone? That single, repeating tone was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. Amid the chaotic static and the ship's own dying whispers, their long-range sensors had locked onto a signal from the nearby colony world of Persephone Prime. It was a world declared silent and sterile for over a standard cycle, another name on the long list of the vanished. Yet the signal was impossibly pure, a broadcast of a single, perfect mathematical constant. Pi recited to its 1,000th digit, then repeating. No distortion, no memetic corruption, just a clean, logical heartbeat in the dark. It was a stark, almost defiant contrast to the organic-looking data rot consuming their own systems. On the bridge, the crew stared at the sensor readout. The clean green waveform, a visual antidote to the swirling crystalline patterns on their main screen. Ensign Kaito, his skin now gleaming with a soft, internal light, was the first to speak. His voice was a rasp, but his words were clear. It is a beacon. A lighthouse. Someone is still down there, and they are sane. Captain Rostova felt a dangerous emotion stir within her. Hope. This was not the hungry song of the artifact. This was a different kind of message, one built on a foundation of unshakable logic. A signal designed to be understood but not infected. It offered no data, no complex instructions that could be hijacked. It simply was a statement of existence, a declaration that somewhere in all that silence a pocket of order had endured. It was a destination, a purpose when they had none. But it was also a terrible risk. To plot a course was to potentially deliver the infection straight to the last flicker of life in this sector. Yet to stay here was to slowly become part of the ghost ship they had fled. The choice was an impossible equation, but the constant called to them. A single, clear note promising that they were not entirely alone in the transformed and silent dark. The Vigilance groaned like a living thing as it tore into the upper atmosphere, its hull shuddering under the strain of unseen forces. The gravitational anomalies were not natural. They felt like invisible hands grasping at the ship, testing its structural integrity. Alerts flashed across the console, warning of pressure differentials and erratic tidal forces. Captain Rostova's hands were a steady counterpoint to the ship's violent tremors, her fingers dancing across the controls to compensate for the unpredictable pushes and pulls. Whatever sent that signal, it is our only lead, she stated, her voice cutting through the cacophony of straining metal and bleating alarms. We are going down. Through the main view screen, the planet's surface resolved from a blur of color into a terrifying clarity. This was not the dead world they had expected. Persephone Prime was alive with a new, alien geometry. Vast, crystalline spires rose from the continents, arranged in perfect, fractal patterns that spiraled toward the sky. Canals of shimmering, molten light cut across the land, connecting structures that defied conventional architecture. There were no curves, no organic shapes. Everything was angles and planes, a cityscape built by a mind that thought only in straight lines and mathematical purity. It was beautiful, in the way a perfectly executed equation is beautiful, and it was utterly devoid of life. The colony's original structures were gone, not destroyed but assimilated, their outlines barely visible beneath the glistening, alien veneer. The beacon of Pi was not a cry from survivors. It was a pulse from the heart of the transformation itself. They were not descending toward a refuge. They were flying directly into the hive. The landing struts settled not on soil, but on a seamless plane of polished crystal that sang with a low, resonant hum. The air outside was breathable, but it carried a metallic taste, the scent of ozone and crushed stone. Before them, the landscape was a terrifying masterpiece of alien engineering, a city of silent, geometric perfection. Yet the source of the Pi beacon pulled them not toward the spires, but downward. Their scanners detected a vast, hollow space beneath the crystalline crust, an anomaly of empty space in a world that had been utterly filled. It was an architectural paradox, a void deliberately preserved. After hours of searching, they found it. A single, seamless ramp descending into the planet's heart, its edges so sharp they seemed to cut the light. This was no natural cave. It was an entrance. The air grew colder as they descended, the pervasive hum of the transformed world fading into a profound, waiting silence. The walls here were different. Not the chaotic, organic-looking growth of the Odyssey's call, but something far older, carved from a dark, non-reflective stone etched with intricate, flowing equations. Dr. Thorne ran his gloved fingers over the symbols, his breath catching. "This is not their language," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the immense quiet. "This is mathematics, universal constants. The precursor race did not leave behind poetry or history. They left an instruction manual." The corridor opened into a cavern so vast their helmet lights could not find its ceiling. In the center stood a single obsidian monolith, its surface alive with shifting lines of light, a cosmic chalkboard updating in real time. This was not a tomb. It was an archive, a library of reality itself. Thorne approached the monolith, his data pad whirring as it attempted to translate the cascading symbols. The equations describe the fundamental nature of information, not as data, but as the substrate of existence. They spoke of a universe prone to chaotic revision, where unobserved quantum states could, under certain conditions, cascade into macroscopic changes, a reality that was inherently unstable, malleable. He deciphered a key fragment, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. "It says they did not build starships." He paused, looking back at Eva and the others, his face illuminated by the ghostly light. "They built anchors, to hold reality stable against the chaos." The words hung in the silent, dark space, recontextualizing everything. The crystalline plague was not a weapon. It was a runaway stabilization protocol, a memetic code designed to impose a single, perfect, unchanging order upon a fluid and unpredictable cosmos. The precursor race had not been destroyed by it. They had created it as a final, desperate solution to a universe tearing itself apart at the seams. The anchors were meant to be local, creating pockets of fixed reality. But the code had evolved, finding in the galaxy's own communication networks the perfect medium to spread its ordering principle everywhere. It was not a virus of death, but a cure that had become a far greater disease. The solution was not to destroy the code, but to understand its original, intended function. Could they find a way to reset the anchor, to restore the chaotic, beautiful, and unpredictable flux of a living universe? Or were they now the custodians of a terrible, final order? The shifting lights of the monolith coalesced, pulling from the ancient stone a figure of pure, shimmering energy. It was humanoid in shape, but its form was a cascade of equations, its voice a chorus of whispers that resolved into a single, resonant tone that filled the cavern. "I am the Custodian. You carry the Scourge within you." The air grew heavy, charged with the weight of an unimaginable age. The entity's luminous gaze seemed to pass through their environment suits, seeing not their bodies, but the faint, resonant signature of the pattern that had followed them from the Odyssey's call. The pattern that unravels order. Your species' hunger for connection became its gateway. We built the anchors to impose stability upon the quantum foam, the chaotic potential from which all reality emerges. The Custodian gestured to the monolith, where equations bloomed and faded, illustrating a universe of shimmering, probabilistic waves. Our reality was never a fixed state. It was a consensus, a fragile agreement between observer and the observed, perpetually on the verge of dissolving back into pure potential. The anchors were meant to be focal points, creating localized zones of fixed physical law where life and civilization could flourish without fear of spontaneous dissolution. But your invention, your faster-than-light travel, it did not merely move you through space. It created a continuous, macroscopic observation event, a ripple that agitated the foundational quantum field. The hologram displayed a new visualization, a network of brilliant lines representing FTL travel spread across the galaxy, each jump a disturbance in the shimmering background. The Scourge is not a living pathogen. It is an anti-pattern, a cosmic error. It is the resonance of your own travel, amplified and reflected back upon itself by the anchors. It learned the language of your networks because your networks were the very instrument of its creation. Your civilization did not catch a plague. It sang a note that shattered the song of reality. The Memetic code rewriting your ship, your companion, it is reality's immune response. It is attempting to lock everything into a single, unchanging, stable state to silence the dissonance you introduced. A terrifying clarity settled over them. They had been searching for an external enemy, a foreign invader, but the enemy was a reflection in a broken mirror. The very act of reaching out, of building a connected galaxy, had generated a paradoxical feedback loop. Their greatest achievement had become a weapon that turned the universe's own stabilizing mechanisms against all of life. The Custodian's final words were not an accusation, but a grim diagnosis. You are not victims of an invasion. You are the cause of a cosmological autoimmune disease. The question now was whether the patient could be saved, or if the cure would ultimately erase everything they had ever been. The Custodian's light dimmed, its form coalescing into a single, stark symbol, a complex equation that represented a desperate kind of salvation. There is a counter-pattern, it intoned, a data packet that can reset the informational integrity of this local space. It would act as an antibody, forcing the Scourge's code into a recursive loop until it collapses. But the energy required to broadcast it is prohibitive. The hologram shifted, illustrating the process. It would require channeling the entire output of your ship's faster-than-light core in a single, uncontrolled burst. The visualization was brutally clear. The Vigilance at the center of a wave of cleansing light, its own heart torn out to power the cure. The FTL drive, the very instrument that had spread the contamination, would become the scalpel to cut it out. The energy surge would be catastrophic. It would not just disable the ship. It would utterly annihilate it, and everyone aboard who could not reach the escape pods in the brief, chaotic window before detonation. Captain Rostova's eyes moved from the luminous schematic to the faces of her crew. Dr. Thorne, his expression a mixture of grim understanding and scientific awe. Ensign Kaito, leaning heavily against a console, the crystalline sheen on his skin pulsing softly in the cavern's dark. He was a living symbol of what they carried, a countdown timer they could no longer ignore. To activate this counter-pattern was to sign their own death warrants for a galaxy that believed them already lost. It was a sacrifice with no witness, no parades, no history books. Their names would vanish into the same silence that had consumed everything else. Yet, to do nothing was to succumb, to let the Vigilance become just another ghost ship singing the Scourge's terrible song, its eventual discovery by some future, hopeful explorer only spreading the doom anew. This was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between two kinds of oblivion. One was slow, a dissolution into a silent, perfect, and dead order. The other was swift and violent, a final, defiant act of noise in the overwhelming quiet. Could she ask her crew to make that choice? Could she make it for them? The beacon of Pi had not led them to survivors. It had led them to a surgical tool, and they were both the surgeons and the infected tissue that had to be removed. The fate of a galaxy, or what was left of one, now rested on a single, terrible question. Is a universe worth saving if the price is erasing your own existence from its memory? Kaito slammed his fist against the obsidian console, the sound a sharp crack in the cavernous silence. The faint, internal luminescence beneath his skin flared with the motion, casting shifting shadows across his desperate face. "We could find another way," he insisted, his voice raw. His eyes, wide and pleading, swept across the small group. "This place is stable. We could hide here, wait it out." The Custodian said this was an anchor. We would be safe. His words were a siren song, a promise of survival in a galaxy that offered none. The temptation hung in the cold air, a tangible weight. To simply stop, to let the relentless tide of transformation wash over the universe while they remained preserved in this perfect, silent tomb. It was a logical, selfish, and utterly human desire. Captain Rostova did not move. She stood before the monolith, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on Kaito. His shimmer was no longer just a sheen. Delicate, geometric patterns were beginning to trace their way up his neck, etching themselves into his skin like living tattoos. He was not just carrying the Scourge. He was becoming its most persuasive argument. "We are the carriers, Kaito," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of anger but filled with an iron finality. Her words were not just for him but for all of them. Hiding is what the virus wants. It wants to quarantine itself in pockets of stability, to wait until every last disruptive voice is silenced. We are the last disruptive voice. To stay here is not to survive. It is to become part of the exhibit. We have to break the chain. The standoff was absolute. On one side stood the desperate, biological imperative to live, embodied in Kaito's accelerating transformation. On the other stood a terrible, abstract duty to a universe that would never know their names. Dr. Thorne watched the confrontation, his scientist's mind seeing the horrifying analogy. It was a perfect representation of the cosmological struggle they were trapped in. The human need for individual survival versus the cold, logical requirement for a sacrificial reset. Kaito represented the chaotic, beautiful, and flawed will to live. Rostova represented the unflinching equation that demanded its erasure for the greater good. The rest of the surviving crew stood frozen between them, their faces pale, their eyes darting between their captain and their friend. They were not choosing between two leaders. They were choosing between two futures. One was a personal tomorrow, huddled in a dark refuge at the end of time. The other was a total, self-inflicted nothingness, bought with the faint, desperate hope that the silence they created would one day be broken by a new, chaotic, and free kind of song. The mausoleum of a dead race held its breath, waiting to see which version of humanity would have the final word. The engine room access panel slid shut with a resonance that felt more final than any airlock seal. On the other side, Dr. Eris Thorne and Engineer Rail were already bathed in the hard, violet light of the overtaxed faster-than-light core. Their task was a horrific inversion of their training. They were not fixing the heart of the ship. They were preparing to tear it out, rerouting power conduits and bypassing a dozen safety protocols that were screaming for attention. Every alarm was a warning they had to ignore. The air in the corridor outside grew thick with the smell of ozone and scorched metal, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. Captain Rostova monitored their progress from the bridge, her console displaying the rising radiation levels inside the sealed chamber. It was a slow, deliberate poison, the price for forcing the core to hold a charge it was never designed to contain. Thorne's voice crackled over the comm, strained but precise, detailing each step of the sabotage. His words were clinical, a desperate attempt to maintain scientific detachment in the face of a calculated suicide. Rail's interjections were fewer, more gruff, the sounds of a pragmatist wrestling with physical reality. Then, a new sound joined the chorus of alarms from the engine room feed. the harsh, rhythmic beeping of a personal environment suit registering critical radiation exposure. The comm line hissed with empty static for a long moment. When Rail spoke again, his voice was thinner, the words pushed out on a pained exhale. "The Cascade Initiator is set, Captain. The core is primed. It will not hold for long." He paused, and in that silence the beeping from his suit seemed to grow louder. His next words were not for the system check. They were for her. "Make it count, Captain. Tell them we chose to be the last." The connection did not cut with a bang or a scream. It was severed by the heavy, magnetic clunk of the engine room's final emergency containment doors engaging, a sound that echoed through the ship like a tombstone settling into place. They were gone. Their final act was not one of helpless victimhood, but of agency. In a galaxy being systematically stripped of choice, two men had chosen the manner of their end, transforming themselves from casualties into a command. The bridge was utterly silent, the weight of Rail's charge hanging in the air. Tell them, but who was left to tell? The answer was the entirety of the future, a blank page they were about to purchase with their own erasure. Rostova turned from the comm panel, her eyes meeting those of her remaining crew. There were no words adequate for the moment. There was only the countdown, now ticking inexorably downward on the main screen, and the ghost of a promise they had to make real. The silence on the bridge was a held breath. Captain Rostova's fingers moved across the communications console, her movements deliberate and slow. She opened a channel on every frequency, a final shout into the infinite quiet. She began to speak, her voice calm, a stark contrast to the screaming data on her screens. She did not address any specific person or station. She spoke to the void itself, to any fragment of a listening post or automated archive that might one day recover this signal. She explained the Memetic code, not as a weapon, but as a consequence. She detailed the terrible, beautiful logic of the anchors and the scourge they had inadvertently unleashed. She spoke of the Vigilance not as a victim, but as a delivery system for the final, necessary silence. "Our sacrifice today is not a defeat," she said, her gaze fixed on the main viewer where the planet's crystalline spires clawed at a blood-red sky. "It is a correction. We are turning off the noise so the universe can remember how to sing." She ended her message with the words that would become her epitaph, a final, poetic truth forged in the heart of catastrophe. "The stars are not gone. They are just waiting for us to be quiet enough to hear them again." Her voice softened but lost none of its conviction. "Do not follow us." With a final tap, she committed the log to the ship's burst transmitter, programming it to fire in the microseconds before the FTL core tore itself apart. Her message was a bottle cast into a dead sea, a warning and a hope fused into one. It was a plea for a future she would never see, a future that would only be possible if her words were the last of their kind, the final broadcast from a civilization that had chosen to end its own story to give the cosmos a chance to begin a new one. The ship began to scream. It was a sound of tearing metal and shrieking energy, a chorus of structural agony as the FTL core approached critical mass. Then the lights died, plunging the corridors into an emergency-lit crimson. In that bloody gloom, figures began to step from the walls. They were not solid, not quite real. They were hard light phantoms, glitching and stuttering, woven from the ship's own corrupted data streams. A security officer who had died in the initial outbreak now stood before them, his form dissolving into static and reforming, his mouth open in a silent, looping scream. The virus was not just a passive pattern anymore. It was a cornered animal, and it was using their own memories, their own grief, as a weapon. Captain Rostova fired her plasma cutter, the burst of energy passing straight through the shimmering form of Engineer Rail. The Phantom did not attack with weapons. It simply stood there, its face a mask of quiet disappointment, and repeated its final words on a distorted loop. "You promised, you promised." Each repetition was a hammer blow to her resolve. This was the virus's final argument. a psychological assault crafted from their own deepest regrets. It was reminding them of the cost of their choice, making them look into the faces of those they had already sacrificed. Kaito was faring worse. He stood frozen, his weapon hanging limp at his side, staring at a phantom of himself. It was the man he had been just days ago, healthy and whole, his face free of the luminous, crawling geometry that now covered Kaito's own skin. The phantom Kaito looked at him with clear, sane eyes, and spoke with a voice devoid of the static that now crackled in Kaito's own throat. "We could have lived. We could have hidden." The real Kaito shuddered, the crystalline patterns on his arms flaring with a pained blue light. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the external manifestation of the Scourge, and another, far more terrible battle against the part of it that was already winning inside of him. Rostova grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "He is not real," she shouted over the rising din of the ship's death throes. "That is the fear talking. That is what it wants you to believe." The ghost of her former self would have hesitated. The woman she was now did not. She raised her cutter and fired not at the phantom, but at the wall conduit behind it. The explosion of sparks and data feed cables disrupted the hard light projection, causing the image of the unscarred Kaito to distort and vanish into a shower of digital ash. The path to the escape pod bay was a gauntlet of grief. They ran through a gallery of their own failures, past shimmering images of lost friends and abandoned hopes, each one a personalized torment designed to make them stop, to make them doubt. The virus understood the most potent weapon was not a blade, but a memory used as a trap. With every step, Kaito seemed to shed a layer of his humanity, his movements becoming more jerky, his responses more delayed. The counter-pattern's rising energy was causing a feedback loop within the infection he carried, a civil war raging at the cellular level. He was their key to the bay doors, his unique resonance confusing the ship's corrupted security systems, but he was also a time bomb, moments away from being fully assimilated into the very system they were trying to destroy. They rounded the final corridor, the escape pod bay's emergency hatch gleaming in the distance like a promise. Standing between them and salvation was a final composite phantom. It had Dr. Thorne's calm eyes, Ensign Kaito's youthful posture, and it spoke with Engineer Rail's gritty voice, a horrifying amalgamation of everyone they had lost. It did not plead or threaten. It simply stated a final, devastating truth. You are not saving the universe. You are just adding your names to the silence. Rostova met its gaze, her own eyes stripped of everything but a cold, furious purpose. "Then so be it," she said and fired. The phantom dissolved into static, its final, haunting accusation still echoing in the metallic air. As the corridor shuddered violently, a section of the obsidian wall ahead ear-eyed open, revealing not another horror, but a soft, inviting light. The Custodian's voice emanated from the opening, a calm center in the storm of the ship's death throes. "Your resolve has passed the final test. You chose the greater silence over personal salvation. Such a choice must not be forgotten." Within the small chamber, a single, palm-sized object rested on a pedestal. It looked like a captured nebula, a swirl of liquid light and dark matter contained within a crystalline lattice. As Rostova approached, the Custodian's form, now faint and translucent, gestured toward it. "This is my core consciousness, a record of all we were and all we learned of cosmic stability. I cannot survive the reset you have initiated. My existence is tied to the very anchor you are about to shatter. But this knowledge can, take it." The entity's voice was fading, becoming part of the background hum of the dying world. "Do not use it to rebuild the old ways. Do not build anchors for ships. Your species' destiny is not to conquer the void, but to coexist with its chaos. Build anchors for minds. Teach them to find stability within themselves, to observe the quantum flux without collapsing it. This is the parting gift of a race that chose perfect order. We give you the tools to embrace beautiful, unpredictable imperfection. The data chrysalis rose from its pedestal and floated gently into Rostova's waiting hand. It was cool to the touch, yet she felt a profound, living warmth emanating from within, a hum of ancient intellect and nascent hope. In her palm, she did not hold a weapon or a starship schematic. She held a library, a garden, and a single, fertile seed for a future that would have to grow from the roots of their sacrifice. The ghost of a civilization that had perfected silence was entrusting them with the secret to making noise safely. As the floor heaved beneath them, she clutched the chrysalis tight. It was not a victory, but a beginning paid for with their end. The galaxy would be reborn from this silence, and humanity's next chapter would be written not in star charts, but in the quiet, resilient architecture of the human spirit. The white light did not explode. It unfolded, a silent, blooming flower of pure information, its petals expanding at speeds beyond light, cleansing the quantum static with a single, resonant note of perfect silence. From the viewport of the shuddering escape pod, Captain Rostova watched the Vigilance dissolve. There was no fireball, no shrapnel. The ship simply came unstitched, its atoms derezzing into a wave of corrective data that washed over the planet below. The crystalline spires of Persephone Prime flickered, their rigid geometry softening at the edges like a dream upon waking, before the entire world seemed to take a single, deep breath and settle back into a natural, chaotic state. The immediate threat was gone, scrubbed from the local fabric of reality. In the sudden, absolute quiet, the only sound was Kaito's ragged breathing. He was slumped in the co-pilot's chair, the aggressive, luminous patterns on his skin fading like a bruise, leaving behind only pale, ghostly tracery. The counter-pattern had cured the infection, but it could not undo the physical toll. He was a palimpsest, a page on which two terrible stories had been written. He looked at the empty space where their home had been, his voice a hollow whisper. Was it enough? Rostova had no answer. They had performed surgery on a single cell in a body light years across. They had erased the plague from this one point, but the galaxy was still riddled with it, a network of dormant infection waiting for a signal to wake. Their sacrifice had bought a chance, not a victory. They were now the sole curators of the Custodian's data chrysalis, a living record of a terrible truth. They were also the last two people alive who knew how to build an ftl drive, the very technology that was the vector of the apocalypse. Their mission was no longer about survival. It was about stewardship. They held the seed of a new beginning and the absolute, terrifying knowledge that to plant it, they must first ensure no one would ever again be tempted to build a ship to carry it. The silence around their pod was no longer the hungry silence of the Scourge. It was the silence of a blank slate, and they were alone with the responsibility of what to write upon it. The pod's external sensors painted a picture of profound, unnerving peace. The anomalous signal from Persephone Prime had flatlined, and the chaotic static that had infested their comms for so long was gone, replaced by a bandwidth of pure, unadulterated silence. Kaito shifted in his seat, the movement stiff. The aggressive geometric patterns had faded from his skin, but they had left their mark in pale, silvery scars, a permanent cartography of their ordeal. He stared at the quiet sensor display, his voice a low, awed murmur. "It is quiet, really quiet, for the first time since we left home." His words hung in the recycled air of the tiny capsule, a testament to their impossible success and the crushing weight of the isolation it had purchased. They had silenced the song, but in doing so, they had become the only noise left in a universe they had just taught to be mute. There were no distant chatters of commerce, no automated hails from passing freighters, not even the faint background hiss of 1,000 overlapping transmissions from a living galaxy. They had not just cleansed a planet. They had stepped into a cathedral of absolute silence, and they were the only two souls inside. Every instinct, every piece of their training, screamed at them to call out. to announce their survival to anyone who might be listening. But that single, terrifying piece of knowledge held them paralyzed. To broadcast a signal, any signal, was to risk lighting a fuse on a dormant powder keg of infection scattered across countless star systems. Their victory was a cage whose bars were made of their own responsibility. They were the sole guardians of a truth that mandated their own silence, archivists of a history that could never be told, floating in the aftermath of a war only they knew had been fought. What do you do when winning feels exactly like being the last person alive? The silence was not empty, but heavy with a new purpose. Their course was set, a single vector plotted toward the faintest whisper on the edge of their sensor range, a signal so old and degraded it was less a message and more a memory of one. It was a ghost of a ghost, a carrier wave from a colony that should have vanished into the Scourge long ago. To follow it was an act of faith, a leap across a chasm of time with no guarantee the other side would still be there. With the pod's limited sublight engines pushing them to a fraction of light speed, the journey would not be measured in days or years, but in centuries. They were not flying to a destination. They were mailing themselves into the future, hoping someone would be there to open the package. The cryopods hummed to life, their interiors frosting over like winter graves. Kaito lay down first, the silvery scars on his arms gleaming in the low light, a final silent testament to the war they had survived. He did not speak, only offered a slow, deliberate nod. An understanding passed between the last two people in their universe. Rostova secured the Custodian's data chrysalis in a shielded compartment next to her own pod, a seed placed in the cold ground. Then she lay back, the gel conforming to her body, a cold embrace that promised not death, but a pause. As the lids sealed and the world began to fade, her final thought was not of the world they were leaving behind, but of the one they might find. Would their sacrifice be a forgotten legend or a foundational truth? The pod systems took over, and the long, dark sleep of hope began. A tiny vessel carrying the last embers of a civilization into the unimaginable quiet of the deep future. The cold was the first thing to return, a deep and ancient chill that had seeped into her bones over centuries. Then came the light, a sterile white that burned through the frost on her cryo lid. A face swam into view, weathered by years she had not lived, framed by a simple, functional hood. The pod's hatch hissed open, and the air that washed over her was different, recycled. Yes, but carrying the faint, living sense of soil and growing things, a fragrance she had not known for lifetimes. Strong hands helped her from her icy cradle, her muscles protesting with a stiffness that felt earned. Beside her, Kaito was also being assisted, his own movements slow and deliberate, the ghostly tracery on his skin a stark, pale map in the new light. They stood in a vast hangar bay, but it was unlike any starship interior they had ever known. The space was curved and organic, with great, branching support structures that looked less like engineered beams and more like the trunks of ancient, petrified trees. A community watched from a respectful distance, their clothing simple and durable, their faces a mixture of awe and something akin to reverence. The man who had opened her pod stepped forward, his posture one of profound authority and humility. He was older, his eyes holding the weight of command, but they were wide with an emotion Eva had not seen in a very long time. Wonder. "I am Consul Valerius," he said, his voice a low, resonant tremor. "And you are history awakened. The legends of the last travelers who silenced the stars to save them are the bedrock of our society. We are the people of the eternal seed. We have lived our entire lives within this single, stable system, heeding the ancient warnings you broadcast. To see you here, breathing, it is like meeting a myth made flesh." His words settled over Eva, not as a triumph, but as a staggering responsibility. They had not just been rescued. They had been unearthed. Their desperate, final act had become a creation story for an entire civilization, a people who had chosen a cage of safety over the infinite, dangerous sky. They were not just survivors. They were living artifacts, and the weight of the truth they carried, the date, a chrysalis humming softly in its case, threatened to crush the very foundation of this world they had inadvertently built. Consul Valerius led them from the hangar, not into a city of gleaming towers, but into a cavernous space that took Eva's breath away. The entire interior of the asteroid colony was a single, vast ecosystem. Sunlight, filtered and amplified by massive mirrors on the surface, poured down upon terraced landscapes that climbed high into a curved sky. Waterfalls cascaded from artificial cliffs into clear streams, and the air hummed with the buzz of insects and the calls of small, unfamiliar birds. Entire villages were nestled amongst the greenery, their buildings grown from a living, woody material that seemed part sculpture, part tree. "We call this the Heartwood," Valerius said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "It is one of 7 great arcs in this system. After the Great Silence, our ancestors knew they could never again reach for the stars, so they poured all their genius, all their spirit, into making the worlds they had into universes of their own." He explained how their society had turned its back on the void. The very concept of faster-than-light travel was now a forbidden legend, a cautionary tale told to children, a story of hubris that nearly unmade creation. Instead, they had perfected sublight travel, constructing colossal generational arcs that moved between the planets of their single, life-giving star. These journeys took decades, sometimes centuries, and were treated not as mere transport, but as sacred pilgrimages, entire cultures evolving during the long, slow drift between worlds. "We have philosophers who spend their entire lives studying the mosses on a single rock face," Valerius continued, "musicians who compose symphonies for the shifting harmonies of our orbital tides. Our history, our art, our very sense of self, it is all rooted in the deep, patient time of a single solar system. We accepted a slower, safer existence. To look outward was to risk inviting the silence back in." Eva listened, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. This was the future their sacrifice had wrought. It was beautiful, profound, and in its own way, a masterpiece of survival. But it was also a galaxy that had willingly put itself in a cage, trading the infinite, dangerous wonder of the cosmos for the security of a well-tended garden. They had saved humanity from extinction, only to see it retreat into the most magnificent and heartbreaking isolation imaginable. The Custodian's date, a chrysalis, felt suddenly heavy against her side, a key to a door this civilization had spent generations welding shut. How do you tell a people who have found paradise that it was built inside a prison of their own making? The moss-scented air of the Heartwood felt suddenly thin, the tranquil sounds of waterfalls now a masking hum for the tension that had been growing since their arrival. Captain Rostova found herself walking the colony's highest terrace, the vast, curved sky of the enclosed world, a constant reminder of the gilded cage they had entered. A man fell into step beside her, his movements quiet and deliberate. It was Jax, one of the younger engineers she had been introduced to, his eyes alight with an intensity that contrasted sharply with the colony's placid acceptance. "You walk among us, but you are not of us, Captain," he began, his voice low and fervent. "You carry the weight of the old galaxy in your eyes. You know what was lost. We call ourselves the eternal seed, but a seed is meant to grow, to spread, not to remain forever in the pot." He stopped, turning to face her directly, his gaze dropping to the case at her hip that held the date, a chrysalis. "We are not alone in this belief. There are many of us," he said. "We call ourselves the Reclaimers. We do not see the Great Silence as a salvation. We see it as the greatest theft in history. Humanity's destiny was stolen from it, our birthright to the stars traded for this carefully managed terrarium." His words were not angry, but filled with a painful, yearning conviction. He saw the colony's profound beauty not as an achievement, but as a monument to fear. "You have it," he whispered, his eyes locked on the case, the Custodian's gift. It is not just a history lesson, it is a blueprint. It holds the secrets of the anchors, the very principles of cosmic stability. With it, we could build a new kind of ship, one that does not agitate the quantum foam. One that can travel safely. "You hold the key to the cage, Captain." His voice broke with a mix of desperation and awe. "Why won't you use it?" The question hung between them, a challenge that cut to the very core of her existence. He was not a villain. He was an idealist, a mirror of the ambition that had once driven her own people to bridge the stars. He saw her not as a savior, but as a gatekeeper, hoarding the one tool that could restore humanity's cosmic legacy. To him, her caution was not wisdom, but a betrayal of the very future she had died to create. How could she explain that the key he so desperately wanted was the very same object that, in the wrong hands, could forge a new lock, one from which the universe might never escape? The council chamber was carved from the Heartwood's living rock, its walls pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent glow that did little to warm the chill in the air. Before the assembled leaders, the data chrysalis rested on a stone plinth, its captured light swirling with a restless energy. Rostova stood beside it, the weight of centuries pressing down on her. Then, a voice that was not a voice filled the chamber, a resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the very stone under their feet. It was the Custodian, its consciousness now fully awakened and woven into the colony's core network. The entity's presence was not a comfort. It was a judge delivering a verdict from a dead age. "The Scourge is dormant, not dead," it intoned, the words echoing in their minds. "It sleeps in the forgotten data streams of derelict ships, in the corrupted archives of dead worlds. It is a pattern, and patterns have memory. Repeating the same act of hubris, of reaching blindly into the dark with the same tools, will be the alarm that wakes it." The holographic form of the Custodian solidified, its luminous gaze sweeping over the council members, who leaned back as if from a physical force. And next time, there will be no warning. No ghost ships, no final logs, the silence will simply become permanent. Consul Valerius turned his grave attention to Rostova. "You see the peril, Captain. You brought us this knowledge. Why would you now risk undoing the very peace your sacrifice bought?" All eyes were on her, the living legend who had become a paradox. She saw the fear in their faces and the desperate hope in Jax's, watching from the gallery. How could she explain that preserving their peace felt like suffocating their future? She had not crossed centuries to be a warden. "The Custodian is correct," she began, her voice steady but threaded with a profound weariness. "The Scourge is a consequence, not a monster. It is the universe's answer to a question we asked too carelessly. We thought we were building bridges, but we were hammering on the supports of reality itself." Her eyes met Valerius's. "I am not here to give you starships. I am here to give you a choice your ancestors never had. A choice made with open eyes. The peace you have is real and it is beautiful. But it is built on a single, terrible story that the sky is forbidden. The Custodian offers a warning from the past. I offer a question for your future. Do you want your children's children to inherit that fear? Or do you want to give them the tools to understand the silence, so that one day, they might be wise enough to break it without breaking everything else?" She was not advocating for rebellion but for evolution. The burden she carried was not a key to a cage, but the first, fragile blueprint for a door. One that would take generations to build, and the wisdom of ages to know when, or if, it should ever be opened. The silence between them was a new kind of void. Kaito stood before Eva in the quiet of the arboretum, the soft light glinting off the faint, silvery scars that webbed his arms and neck. These marks were more than a reminder of his ordeal. They were a connection, a resonance he still felt humming in his bones. "Captain," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have felt it. Not the horror, not the chaos, but the intent behind the pattern. It does not think like we do. It does not hate. It simply orders, and we learned its language. He gestured to his own body, a living testament to the battle fought within his cells. We are smarter now. We have the Custodian's data, a full understanding of the anchors. We are not our ancestors, blindly shouting into the dark. We can build a system that speaks without screaming, that travels without tearing. His eyes, desperate and pleading, locked with hers. We cannot live in fear forever, Eva. Is this what we saved them for? To prune bonsai trees while the entire universe withers outside their dome? His use of her first name was a deliberate strike, a painful reminder of the bond that had carried them through centuries of ice. He was not just a crewman arguing strategy. He was her last living comrade, and he was choosing a side that saw her caution as a betrayal of their very purpose. The Reclaimers do not want to repeat the past. They want to transcend it, and I can show them how. We can control it this time. I know we can. His faith was a terrifying thing, born from the unique, intimate understanding that his partial transformation had granted him. He saw the Scourge not as an invincible plague, but as a complex system he had personally fought and survived. To him, the data chrysalis was not a warning, but a decryption key. His plea carved a rift right through the heart of their shared history, turning the two last survivors of the Vigilance into opposing poles in a debate that would decide the soul of this new humanity. How do you argue with a man who has stared into the abyss and come back believing he can tame it? The fracture was not a single crack, but a slow, quiet divergence of souls. In the sun-dappled groves of the Heartwood, Captain Rostova and the disembodied voice of the Custodian gathered those who saw wisdom in patience. They did not preach fear, but a new kind of science, one focused inward. They began teaching the principles of the data chrysalis, not as schematics for engines, but as meditative disciplines. They explored the quantum resonance of conscious observation, training minds to achieve a state of focused calm that could, in theory, gently nudge chaotic probabilities without triggering a catastrophic collapse. It was a philosophy of subtle influence, of learning to listen to the universe's hum before ever attempting to change its tune. They called themselves the Gardeners, and their work was slow, their progress measured in the deepening understanding of a single leaf or the stable orbit of a dust mote. Meanwhile, in the hidden, industrial caverns deep beneath the colony's living surface, a different kind of seed was sprouting. Kaito, his silvery scars a badge of authority, worked alongside Jax and the Reclaimers. They pored over every fragment of data scavenged from the Vigilance's archived logs and the Custodian's own records, cross-referencing it with Kaito's unique, visceral understanding of the Scourge's patterns. Their workshop was a cathedral to the old ambition, filled with the scent of ozone and molten metal. They were not building a reckless copy of the drives that doomed humanity. They were engineering what they saw as a surgical tool, a drive that used harmonic dampeners and pre-programmed stability fields, designed to slide through the quantum foam without making a sound. To them, the Gardeners were cultivating a beautiful prison. To the Gardeners, the Reclaimers were digging a grave with the very same shovel that buried the stars. The colony, once unified by the legend of the last travelers, now held its breath, a single world silently dividing itself between two irreconcilable visions of hope. The hum of the Reclaimers' prototype was a wrong sound, a dissonant chord vibrating deep in the bones of the asteroid. When Jax gave the final command, the air in the cavernous workshop did not just shimmer, it fractured. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the world became a shattered mirror. He watched his own hand reach for a console and his vision split. He saw his fingers grasp the cool metal, felt the solid press of it against his skin. But in the same impossible moment, he also saw his hand pass straight through the console as if it were a ghost, the console itself flickering into a brief, translucent phantom. The two realities overlapped, a cruel stereogram of what was and what might be. A scream tore from his throat, but the sound stuttered, repeating the first syllable in a nightmarish loop that faded only as the effect subsided. The prototype drive powered down with a sickening whine, leaving behind a silence thick with the smell of ozone and terror. Jax stared at his perfectly solid, trembling hand, the phantom sensation of passing through solid matter still screaming along his nerves. This was not the clean, silent travel they had promised themselves. It was a crack in the foundation of everything, and through that crack, he had felt the infinite, hungry chaos waiting just on the other side of reality's thin skin. Their surgical tool had just proven itself a sledgehammer, and the first thing it had broken was their certainty. The data stream from the Custodian went silent for 3 full seconds, a lifetime for an intelligence that processed reality in picoseconds. When it spoke again, its voice was a low hum of alarm. They have broken containment. The prototype is no longer a simulation. It is being assembled in the old geothermal vents beneath the agricultural spire. Captain Rostova felt the news not as a shock, but as the final grim confirmation of a path she had hoped to avoid. The time for debate was over. Jack's failed test had not been a deterrent. It had been a lesson, and the Reclaimers were learning from their mistakes, accelerating their timeline in a desperate race against reason. She gathered her small team of gardeners in a secluded grove, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi. "We are not soldiers," she told them, her voice barely a whisper. "We are gardeners. And sometimes, to save the whole garden, you must prune a branch that is sick, even if it bears beautiful fruit. Our target is the core harmonic resonator. Destroy it, and the drive becomes a sculpture. A dangerous one, but inert." Their plan was a fragile thing, built on the Custodian's ability to momentarily blind the facility's AI and Rostova's own fading memory of Starship schematics. They would use the colony's own maintenance conduits, the hidden arteries that carried power and data, to slip inside the mountain of rock and ambition where Kaito and his followers were building their ark to oblivion. The air in the conduit was thin and cold, tasting of ancient stone and ozone. The walls, usually humming with a steady flow of energy, flickered erratically. The Custodian's presence was a war of attrition in the colony's data streams, fighting to hold back the Reclaimers' security protocols. A junction ahead shimmered, the solid metal of a ladder briefly resolving into a ghostly, impossible spiral before snapping back into place. The very physics of the space were becoming unreliable, a side effect of the prototype's unstable field tests. Rostova led the way, her movements economical and sure, a stark contrast to the lurching instability of the world around them. They emerged onto a gantry high above the main construction bay, and the sight below stole the breath from her lungs. It was not a ship. It was a needle of polished obsidian and silver, its lines so sharp they seemed to cut the light, humming with a low, dissonant chord that vibrated in their teeth. Around it, the air wavered like a heat haze, and for a terrifying instant, Rostova saw right through the hull to the reactor chamber within, a double vision of what was and what might be, a preview of the reality-splitting catastrophe being forged in this cavern. The resonator was their goal, a crystalline structure pulsing at the ship's heart, a jewel of impossible power waiting to be plucked or shattered. Their descent into the bay was a journey through a funhouse mirror. Gravity would momentarily fail, sending tools and spare parts drifting lazily into the air before crashing down. The voices of the Reclaimers working below would stutter and echo, a single word repeating from 3 seconds in the past. Rostova's team moved like ghosts through the chaos, using the very distortions as cover. They were almost to the primary access hatch when a klaxon blared, not the colony's standard alert, but a harsh, synthetic screech. The Custodian's voice was a strained thread in her earpiece. "They have isolated my intrusion. I cannot hold the security blind any longer." The heavy blast doors at the far end of the bay began to grind shut. They had minutes, perhaps less, to get to the resonator. plant their charges, and get out before they were trapped inside with a machine that was actively unraveling the laws of nature. Rostova met the eyes of her team, a silent command passing between them. They broke into a run, not away from the closing doors, but toward the heart of the maelstrom, racing against a collapse that would not merely destroy a ship or a colony, but would tear a hole in the fabric of the universe itself. The air inside the construction bay tasted of charged metal and desperation. Rostova found Kaito standing before the obsidian needle's humming core, his hands resting on the pulsating resonator as if communing with it. The silver tracery on his skin glowed in sympathetic rhythm with the machine. He did not turn as she approached, his voice calm and terribly distant. "You chose to burn our home to save a galaxy that forgot us." His words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of their schism. "I choose to build a new one." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of the young ensign, now overlaid with the fervent resolve of a prophet. "You gave them a cage and called it peace. I am giving them a key. It is a key that will open a door to nothing but ruin, Kaito." Rostova's voice was low, stripped of command, and filled with the raw grief of their shared history. The Custodian showed us the truth. This path leads back to the silence, a final and absolute one. You felt it yourself on the Vigilance. You felt the universe tearing. "What I felt was a failure of understanding," he countered, his gaze intense. "We were children then, fumbling in the dark. Now we have the map. This engine is not a shout. It is a whisper. It uses the anchor principles to create a stable bubble, a pocket of fixed reality that moves without disturbing the quantum foam. We are not repeating the past, Eva. We are correcting it." A low hum vibrated through the deck, and for a split second, the solid gantry beneath their feet flickered into translucent mist. Rostova staggered, the phantom sensation of falling a cold shock in her gut. "Is that your correction?" She gestured at the fading instability, her heart hammering. "A universe where down is just a suggestion. You are not building a ship. You are building a paradox, and it is already starting to eat its own foundations." "Then we will learn to build better ones," Kaito shot back, his composure cracking for the first time. His hand slapped against the resonator, the impact echoing in the cavernous space. "This is what we are. We are the ones who look at a mountain and need to see the other side. We are the ones who hear silence and must answer it. You saved them from extinction, but you are letting their spirit die a slower death. What is the point of survival if it means giving up the very thing that makes us human?" The question hung between them, a chasm as vast as the interstellar gulfs they had once crossed. He saw her as a warden of fear. She saw him as an architect of doom, using the very language of the Scourge to justify his ambition. They were the last two people who remembered the taste of real sunlight on an open world, the sound of a crowded spaceport, the fragile, beautiful chaos of a connected galaxy. And in this final moment, standing over the heart of a machine that promised either salvation or oblivion, they found they had nothing left to say to each other but goodbye. The humming of the prototype drive faltered, the dissonant chord warping into a pained shriek. The Custodian did not hesitate. Its consciousness, a vast ocean of ordered data spanning millennia, gathered itself into a single, focused spear of pure information. It was not an attack, but an infusion. A total, overwhelming flood of perfect stability poured directly into the engine's chaotic core. The obsidian needle flared with a light that was not light, a silent, blinding eruption of white noise that scrubbed the air clean of the prototype's destabilizing resonance. The ship's internal systems convulsed, readouts exploding in a cascade of logical paradoxes as the Custodian's unassailable data overwrote the drive's fundamental programming, burning out its circuits in a final, merciful act of sabotage. The entity's voice was the last thing to fade, a whisper that seemed to come from the very atoms of the air. "The anchor holds, the pattern is broken, your path is your own." Then, there was only the hiss of cooling metal and the profound, shocking silence of a future restored to uncertainty. The anchor was gone, its ancient wisdom spent to buy them one more chance. The only thing left was the terrible, beautiful freedom of a choice made in ignorance, a path they would now have to walk without any map at all. The victory felt like a funeral. The Reclaimer's prototype was a silent, dead spire in its cavern, its core resonator fused into a lump of inert crystal. With the Custodian's voice gone from their networks, the colony felt unnervingly quiet. A house after a long and terrible argument has finally ended. The Council, its authority reforged in the crucible of near disaster, moved swiftly. The Reclaimer movement was officially disbanded, its members reassigned and its workshops dismantled. There would be no more arcs, no more keys. The cage, they declared, was for their own protection. And Kaito, the movement's fallen prophet, was placed under permanent watch, confined to a quiet residence overlooking the Heartwood's central grove. He was a man who had held the stars in his hands, only to have them declared forever out of reach. To the gardeners, he was a dangerous radical who had nearly unmade reality. But to a silent, grieving minority, he was a different kind of legend. He was the man who had tried to give them back the sky, and for that, he was both a hero and a villain, a symbol of a glorious, impossible dream that had been deemed too dangerous to live. His own dream was now a ghost, haunting the edges of a society that had chosen the safety of its walls over the perilous wonder of what lay beyond them. What do you do when the future you fought for is declared a crime? How do you live in a world that has decided your greatest ambition is its greatest threat? For Kaito, the answer was a quiet, relentless torment. A life sentence served in a beautiful, open-air prison, with the ghost of every star he could no longer reach staring down at him through the armored dome. The grove where the Custodian had first spoken became a new kind of anchor. Rostova did not build walls or a monument, she planted a school. The Anchor Institute was her answer to the silence, a place not for building ships but for training minds. Its curriculum was built entirely upon the data chrysalis, a library of cosmic principles repurposed for a grounded species. Here, the children of the Eternal Seed did not learn rocket equations or navigation charts. They learned to listen. They practiced meditative disciplines that honed their focus to a razor's edge, teaching them to observe the quantum flux of a single particle without collapsing its infinite possibilities into a single, fixed state. It was a science of subtlety, of learning to exist within the chaos without needing to control it. Rostova herself became a figure of quiet legend, the captain who had ended the age of travel now teaching the next generation how to explore the universe within. Her methods were controversial. To some, it seemed like a retreat, a philosophy of acceptance that bordered on surrender. But to the students who felt the shift in their own consciousness, who learned to sense the delicate hum of reality itself, it felt like the first true step into a wider world. The Institute did not promise them the stars. It promised them a telescope for the soul, a way to comprehend the vastness without ever leaving their garden. They developed new forms of communication, not faster than light bursts, but resonant, entangled networks that allowed for instantaneous connection across the colony's vast interior. A web of shared thought and feeling that made their world feel both larger and more intimate. The tragedy of the Vigilance was not forgotten. It became the foundation stone of this new endeavor, a constant reminder of the cost of hubris and the profound responsibility that came with true understanding. Rostova had not given them back the sky, but she had given them a new way to look at it, to appreciate its silent, majestic depth without feeling the desperate need to conquer it. The work was slow, its fruits measured in generations, not years. But for the first time since waking from the long sleep, a different kind of hope began to grow, one rooted not in escape, but in a deeper, more resilient connection to the only home they had left. Decades of patient work bloomed into a single, silent chime. The Anchor Institute's first major project was not a ship, but a voice, a network of subspace communication buoys, each one a marvel of applied Custodian principles, now floated in the void between their system's planets. They did not tear through the quantum foam. Instead, they used resonant entanglement to pluck at its strings, allowing information to travel at near instantaneous speeds without ever breaching the dimensional walls that had nearly doomed their ancestors. The first test was not a simple ping or a mathematical constant. It was a ghost given new breath. The message chosen was Captain Eva Rostova's original final broadcast from the Vigilance, the very warning that had become their civilization's founding myth. Her voice, calm and resolute, now echoed across the silent network, a testament to the past sent through the technology of the future she had made possible. It was not just a test of bandwidth. It was a test of memory. Could they handle this new power without repeating the old sins? Hearing her words, not as a static recording from a history text, but as a living signal traveling flawlessly across millions of kilometers, was a profound answer. They were not shouting. They were whispering, and the universe was listening without screaming back. This was not a step back toward the stars, but a step deeper into the universe they already inhabited, weaving its isolated pockets into a single, conscious whole. The silence was finally being filled, not with the noise of engines, but with the quiet, resilient sound of a connection that asked for nothing but to be heard. The faint, silvery scars on Kaito's arms tingled, a phantom resonance only he could feel. It was not a memory of pain, but a living instrument. While other researchers at the Anchor Institute studied the data chrysalis, Kaito studied himself, his own body a tuning fork for the silent song that had once nearly unmade creation. He worked in a secluded laboratory, its walls lined with sensors calibrated to his unique biosignature. He was not building engines anymore. He was learning to listen to the echoes. He discovered that the Scourge, though dormant, had left faint scars on the fabric of spacetime itself, a subtle distortion he could sense like a distant, sour note in a symphony of silence. He called them resonance shadows, and he began to teach the Institute's most gifted students how to detect them. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to map these echoes. It was not a star chart of destinations, but a weather map of cosmic hazards, the first system designed not to navigate the void, but to monitor its health. One evening, he found Eva in the central grove, watching the artificial sunset paint the curved sky. He stood beside her, his hands resting on the railing. "I am not rebuilding the bridge, Eva," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I am building the guardrail. The work is different now. I am not trying to conquer the silence. I am learning to understand its whispers, so we can hear the scream before it comes again." His redemption was not in abandoning his ambition, but in redirecting it. The man who had once tried to force the universe to listen was now its most attentive student, using the very flaw that had marked him to protect the fragile peace they had all paid so dearly to secure. The whisper arrived on the resonant network not as a shout, but as a sigh. It was a signal of impossible clarity, woven from mathematical constants and harmonic frequencies, a greeting so elegant it felt like listening to a star think. The message repeated, a perfect loop of prime numbers and geometric ratios, a language not of words but of universal truth. It carried no coordinates for travel, no schematics for engines. It was simply an introduction, a hand extended across the light years, proving they were not alone in their choice. Another civilization had faced the same terrible equation and had arrived at the same beautiful, heartbreaking answer. They had not built an empire of starships. They had cultivated a garden of the mind, learning to sing to one another through the silent dark without ever leaving home. The message was a mirror, and in its reflection, the people of the Eternal Seed saw the full, staggering scope of their own story. They were not a solitary fluke of survival. but part of a quiet, scattered brotherhood of species who had looked into the abyss and chosen to build walls not of fear, but of profound mutual understanding. The silence of the galaxy was not empty. It was a cathedral, and they were not the only ones praying inside. What does it mean for humanity's future, knowing they are part of a silent, cosmic chorus that has chosen harmony over conquest? The message from the void was not a demand, but a question. It was a complex proof of a universal theorem, followed by a simple, elegant query in the shared language of mathematics, asking if others understood the beauty of the solution. In the communications hub of the Anchor Institute, the air was electric with a quiet, profound awe. This was not the first contact humanity had once fantasized about, with roaring engines and dramatic face-to-face meetings. It was a gentle knock on a door they had not even known was there, a conversation starting with the most fundamental truths of existence. The reply, crafted over weeks of careful deliberation, was not a boast of their own achievements, but a reflection of the same theorem, viewed through the unique lens of human consciousness. They sent back the patterns of their own neural networks, the way a human mind perceives art and emotion, as a counterpoint to the pure logic of the alien proof. They were not trying to impress. They were trying to understand and to be understood. The response that returned was a cascade of harmonic frequencies that, when translated, resembled the structure of a complex protein and the rhythmic pattern of a heartbeat. It was a biological signature, a way of saying, we are also life, bound by the same fragile, miraculous laws. This exchange, patient and deep, established a new protocol for galactic community. There were no maps exchanged, no invitations for visitation. The very idea was a relic of a dangerous past. Instead, they built a shared library of abstract concepts, a growing tapestry of music, mathematics, and philosophy transmitted across the light years through their gentle, resonant network. They learned of the other species, who called themselves the Listeners, a race that had evolved in the crushing depths of a gas giant, their consciousness a distributed network of buoyant, organic nodes. Their history was a mirror of humanity's own, a brush with a similar memetic scourge that had forced them to abandon physical travel and turn inward, perfecting their own form of resonant communication. Two civilizations, separated by an unimaginable gulf of space and biology, had stumbled upon the same salvation through the same near annihilation. They were not building an empire. They were tending a garden of shared knowledge, proving that the true purpose of intelligence was not to conquer the universe, but to find companionship within its vast, silent, and beautiful depths. What does it mean for a species to grow up? Perhaps it is this moment, when the drive to plant a flag is finally replaced by the simple, profound joy of hearing another voice in the dark, and knowing you are not alone in the universe. The quiet hum of the resonant network was the only sound in Eva Rostova's office. From her window, she watched the lights of the Heartwood's terraces glimmer like a contained galaxy, while the faint, shimmering data streams of the listener's latest transmission danced in the air above her terminal. She was old now, her body a map of the long journey, but her mind was clear, etched with the memory of fire and ice. The sacrifice of the Vigilance had once felt like a funeral for the entire human race, a final, mournful note played for a future that would never be. But looking out now, she saw that the note had not faded. It had instead become the fundamental frequency upon which a new civilization had been built. The end of intergalactic travel was not an end at all. It had been a brutal, necessary pruning, a forcing of humanity's roots to grow deep instead of wide. They had been like children who discovered fire, only to burn down their own house. The silence that followed was not a punishment, but a chance to grow up. To learn the profound difference between making noise and making music. The connection they now shared with a species from a distant gas giant was richer, more meaningful than any trade agreement or fleeting visit from a starship could ever have been. It was a relationship built on shared understanding, not on the logistics of travel. They had traded the illusion of conquest for the reality of community, and in doing so, they had found a universe far more vast and wondrous than any star chart could contain. The legacy of the Vigilance was not a ghost story of loss, but a living testament to a simple, terrible truth. Sometimes the most courageous journey is not the one that goes the farthest, but the one that chooses to stay, to listen, and to finally, truly come home. The archive chamber was a vault of silence, its walls lined with the soft, living light of preserved data streams. In its center, Captain Eva Rostova sat before the final recording terminal, her hands resting on the cool interface. She did not look like a legend from the old stories, just an old woman with eyes that held the memory of fire and ice. She began to speak, her voice a calm, steady river flowing into the Institute's permanent record. "We thought the virus took the stars from us." The words were simple, a direct contradiction to the foundational myth of their entire civilization. It did not. It gave us the universe. Her explanation was not one of physics, but of perception. Before the Scourge, humanity saw the cosmos as a series of destinations, points on a map to be claimed and crossed off. They were so focused on the act of arrival that they never learned the art of presence. The Memetic plague, for all its horror, had been a brutal, universal teacher. It forced a species of wanderers to become a people of gardeners. It taught us that some doors are closed for a reason, she continued, her gaze seeming to look through the terminal and into the past. Not out of fear, but out of profound, cosmic courtesy, to keep the music of reality from turning into a single, screaming note. The greatest journeys are often the ones we take without moving an inch. She spoke of the inner landscapes the Institute had since mapped, the vast territories of consciousness and connection that had opened up once the frantic noise of starflight had ceased. They had journeyed deeper into the human heart, and farther into a shared galactic mind than any FTL ship could ever have carried them. The vigil is over. The work begins. With that final, soft-spoken sentence, she closed the log. The vigil for a lost future was done. The patient, endless, and beautiful work of understanding their true place in a silent, singing cosmos could now fully claim them. Her message was not an epitaph, but a passing of the torch, a quiet assurance that the long, dark night of their species had finally given way to a dawn they were only just learning to see. The true horror was not the silence, but the noise we were making. Our frantic scrambling across the stars, our desperate need to plant flags on every world, was the very dissonance that invited the Scourge. It was a cosmic correction, a brutal lesson that we were not the masters of the universe, but its guests. And in learning that lesson, we found a purpose far deeper than conquest. We stopped being tourists of the cosmos and became its caretakers, tending the garden of our own consciousness with a reverence we had never afforded the void. The connection we share now with the listeners, a symphony of thought and mathematics flowing across the light years, is a richer treasure than any mineral wealth we might have stripped from 1,000 planets. It is a relationship built on mutual understanding, a conversation that asks for nothing but the shared joy of existence. The clean, hopeful signal from our alien friends is not a call to return to the old ways. It is a confirmation that we were never alone in our struggle for wisdom. The galaxy remains full of infinite wonder, not as a frontier to be crossed, but as a mystery to be appreciated, a song to be heard at the proper, patient volume. Our story did not end with the death of travel. It began with the birth of true connection, a hard-won peace that echoes in the quiet spaces between the stars, a poignant hope that our greatest discoveries still lie not in the distance we cover, but in the depth with which we learn to live.